Gina. I'm Stephanie Clary. I'm the deputy editor here at WNYC and Gothamist. And I'm really excited because this event marks a relaunch of newsroom events here in the Greene space. And the newsroom has, thank you. The newsroom has long been committed to covering housing and homelessness in our city and across the region. But the pandemic, inflation, and rising rents have brought new challenges that underscore the importance of accountability reporting on these issues that affect all New Yorkers. We're excited to facilitate a deeper conversation here today and to discuss the opportunities to prepare for our future. I want to thank Trinity Church Wall Street Philanthropies for your continued support of WNYC and Gothamist and our ongoing coverage of homelessness and housing. And now I want to turn things over. Our housing coverage is rooted in our economics and equity desk, and it is led by Josefa Velasquez. She has covered New York politics for nearly a decade, and she will guide today's discussion, first with Mayor Eric Adams, and then with a panel with Vishaan Chakrabarti, Leah Goodridge, Jessica Katz, and Brad Lander. Thank you all for joining us. We provided cards for audience questions, and we'll be gathering them later in the program. And now I want to introduce Josefa.
We really appreciate you guys being out here today, and we want to give a warm welcome to Mayor Eric Adams, so please give him a round of applause. So, Mr. Mayor, we're really appreciative of your time here with us, and we know we have you for a limited time, and housing is a massive subject that probably everyone in this room cares about. So given that, I want to make sure we talk about your housing plan that you've unveiled, the topic of homelessness, which is a huge issue here, and what our city looks like in the future. So I want to start with the impact of the pandemic. You know, we've seen the pandemic in the last 3 years really spur a sense of urgency and how important affordability is for all of us. You know, it's laid bare a lot of inequities that were sort of simmering under the surface. And because of that, we saw just how many New Yorkers are really on the brink of being able to lose their house or not being able to afford living here. So you've unveiled this plan to create 500,000 units of housing in the next decade. How do we get there?
Well, I think that even before we engage in that conversation, you know, being the mayor, you know, sometimes people look at, you know, you're the mayor, you're first black borough president, state senator, captain in the police department. You know, that's my glory. That's not my story. And for folks like your mom and, you know, English is a second language, you know, I know what it's like to come up from Alabama, living in neighbors, sleeping on the floors in rat-infested buildings. Every week we went to a new location, taking a garbage bag full of clothing to school every day because mom thought we were going to be thrown out and she wanted us to have change of clothing. So I'm not here because I read about homelessness. I'm here because my family lived it. And when you look at what's happening in this city right now, particularly post-pandemic, this is a city of interest. And it's a city where it's getting more and more unaffordable. And so with our plan, and Jessica Katz, who has donated her life to this housing issue, is to look at, let's properly define what are the problems. Very clear, 800,000 people moved to the city. We built 200,000 units of housing.
So clearly not enough.
The math doesn't add up. We have to build more. We have to build more, and we have to find the pathways to build more low income, middle income, and market rate. All three of them, and that is what our plan is looking at. And there are three areas that Jessica and the team, we have focused on. One, the politics of it. If you only know how many times I hear people stand on the steps of City Hall and state, housing is a right, housing is a right. Okay, then you know what? How about me building it in your community? Oh, no, it's not a right there. You know, I got my park, I have my subway station, I have my Whole Foods. We don't need another building in our community.
So let me ask you, how do you change people's minds then?
Well, number one, we have to start asking what Borough President Levine did. At his state of the borough, he said, here are the places in my borough we can build. Eric Botcher did it. Councilman Powers did it. So every city council person, every state senator, every assembly person should be saying to my office, here's where you can build in our community. We have a lot of sacred cows with communities where we have the loudest, yet they don't want to build any affordable housing in their communities. That's unacceptable. Right. We should be building, particularly in places in Manhattan, where you have access to food, access to transportation, access to good schools. If we want to integrate a segregated city, then we need to start building in those communities that have access to these good qualities that we're seeing throughout the city.
And let me ask you, so what are the biggest barriers aside from people saying, no, I don't want this in my backyard? How do we get to building or even converting places to
Well, a couple of things
housing?
we need to look at. Number one, we have to protect what we have. NYCHA has been abandoned by the federal government. We are not doing the right thing on a state level. We need to think differently about NYCHA, and we need to engage the tenants in doing so. So we have to ensure that we make NYCHA, that is the best access to affordable housing we have. Too many units are laying vacant. It is challenging to determine who controls NYCHA nowadays with the special monitor. Who's actually in control? What happened at the Reese houses, what I didn't like, I couldn't fire the person who I believe dropped the ball in Reese houses. So we need to get into NYCHA, think differently about the NYCHA. I'm excited about the project in Chelsea. It's a new way of thinking. Right. People who are stating that we need $35 billion coming from the federal government, we're not getting it. Right. With Republican-controlled House, and we need to stop lying about it and act like and keep telling NYCHA residents, hold on, those bugles we hear, that's not the cavalry, that's taps. NYCHA is dying, and we need to fix NYCHA.
So $35 billion, $40 billion is almost an unthinkable amount of money, and NYCHA's housing is obviously aging, like rapidly. So what can the city do, if anything, to make sure that some of the fixes that need to occur actually happen, considering the state of NYCHA is so poor now?
You look at some of the buildings, it's more expensive to repair them than tearing down and building up. There's a concept that is being floated around in the Chelsea area where a building would be torn down, first build a building that the tenants will go right into the building you built, tear down the building that they're leaving, zero displacement, place them in brand new apartments. I've been in the NYCHA buildings, and I know that some of these buildings are dilapidated to the state of repairing them is unacceptable. You know, I gutted my home when I moved in, and if I attempted to fix it instead of a complete gut job, it would have been a waste of time. But then we need to look at some of the politics, some of the smart things that we're presented, about 114 different changes we believe we need to do on how we are redundancy and repeated reviews over and over again, stated in places we couldn't build, was not acceptable to build, refusing to build higher. So we have to look at each level, what we can do as a city, what we can do in Albany, and what we could do with some of the processes that need to be redefined.
So going back to your housing proposal, I mean, 500,000 units in 10 years, sounds great. I mean, we need all the housing we can get, but is there anything you can do now in 6 months, in a year, to house people who need it?
Well, a couple of things. We need to have a real conversation about 421A, a real vision of it. We need to look at J51. There are things that is taking place right now in Albany, and I really take my hat off even to the governor, what the governor is doing about regional. We need to look at the region, because this is a regional problem. And then immediately, when we got in office, we had 2,500 units of apartments that were vacant. Jessica Katz came in, immediately put in place a plan where we put 1,000 people in. I had the team give me a flow chart of the process, and the redundancy was unbelievable. There was just an antiquated method of how do you take people to move them into available units. That's unacceptable, and there's an easier way to do it, and that's what the team is putting in place.
So just to go back on your housing proposal, one of them is to take these empty office buildings. The pandemic really brought in this era of hybrid work and remote work where people aren't spending as much time in mainland Manhattan than they were back in the day. So I'm curious to hear from you how those conversations are going with Albany. I mean, just across the street, we have an empty office building. How do we turn those into apartments?
We did it before. We did it after September 11. I was a rookie cop in District 2 in Lower Manhattan, and that area was basically a 9 to 6 environment. 6 p.m., it was dead downtown. We understood after September 11, we thought differently. Now you have a thriving community in the area. Many of these buildings can be converted into housing. We have about 10 million square feet of real estate right now that's not being used. And even folks who do have office spaces, they're downsizing. Right. They're not continuing to have the large floor plan. And so there's a great opportunity. We had a project down in Manhattan off of William Street that is a conversion. It's being converted into housing, but the problem is it's being converted into market rate.
Right.
Because if we give the incentive to allow it to be converted into affordable housing, there's some great opportunities to do so.
So how do you define affordable, and how do we make sure that there is affordable housing? Because affordable to one person might be different from someone else.
Without a doubt, and that's a question that I hear all the time. It has almost become a bumper sticker. The reality is we've done a great job of increasing the minimum wage for fast food workers. If you have a full-time person working at McDonald's and his spouse or her spouse is a teacher, we've pushed them out of the low income. So affordable to me is market, middle, low income, because I need my middle income and my market individuals in the city as well. If we take away the moderate incomes, we're going to be forcing the market rates into those apartments that are in the low income. And so affordable is a combination. It's a diversity of this city. I need my fast food workers, my deliveristas, but I also need my teachers. I need my accountants. We had 200,000 African Americans that have left this city. Because it's too expensive, as well as with the security issues we were facing. So affordable to me is every income level, because that's what the city is comprised of.
Right. You mentioned earlier 421A and J51. So for the folks in the crowd who don't know the wonky housing policies, these are tax programs that give incentives to developers if they set aside a portion of their housing towards affordable housing, and that expired 2 years ago now.
Yes.
Time is a flat circle when it comes to the pandemic. So I'm curious about how you're pushing those proposals up in Albany, and how, if you could explain to the crowd why that's needed, why those tax programs are needed now.
Well, many people thought that if we took away 421A, they said it was a giveaway to the developers. It was not. It was an incentive to build. You want to modify it, then do the modification. But when you look at what's in the pipeline, there's a complete drying up of the pipeline. And we can't be so idealistic that we're not realistic.
Right.
Incentivizing and being smart about where you want to do the incentives would allow us to get the housing in the pipeline. And I think that's so important. And then building out near our transportation systems. That's crucial. And J51 was a smart way. It should not have sunsetted. It was a smart way of ensuring that we would continue to housing repairs. I grew up in Brooklyn. I knew what Bushwick Avenue looked like and how people walked away from their buildings. In some cases, they started fires and burned down their entire communities because it became too expensive to actually manage those apartments. And it's crucial that we look at, in a smart way, incentive to continue repairs and building in this city.
So if you could put your state senator hat on for just a second, what does 421A look like? Or what does, incentives for developers look like in order to get affordable housing at the rate that the city needs?
Well, if you look at certain locations where it has been slower in developing, you look at places like what Donovan Richards is doing out in the Rockaways. You look at what's happening in the Bronx. We're getting ready to build out new train stations in that area. We could do some real development around that area. You look at even places in South Jamaica, Queens, what in Leroy Comrie's districts and others, some of the projects near the Supton Boulevard station, where you have the Long Island Railroad and the train to the plane. So if you strategically lay out where you're going to do the development and the incentives, it could be a real win.
Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned Far Rockaway because that's where my mom and I landed when we came to the U.S., and it's where my dad lives now. My brother and I drive up and down the street, hey, Danny, and always talk about, like, how is it possible that this area has not been developed since it's beachfront property? There's a subway close by, and it's, untouched almost by, development, but maybe that changes, and it's such an interesting community and so robust.
And here's what I heard when I was campaigning. No matter which community I traveled in, and you think about it also, people ask two questions when they go to move somewhere. How good are the schools? How safe is the community? Public safety is the prerequisite to our prosperity and making sure our schools are good. And when you look at the safety issue in Rockaway that we've been tackling and the qualities of the schools, when you're looking to raise a family somewhere, the first thing you want to know is how good are the schools, how safe is the community. We make the community safer and we improve upon the school system, which Chancellor Banks is doing. You will see people rush into that beautiful waterfront community.
Yeah, I mean, there's one thing that always sticks in my mind, and it's the words of Jimmy McMillan, the perennial candidate, saying the rent is too damn high. But it's not just rents right now, right? It's also home prices. So I'm curious if there's anything the city could do to bring down those costs.
Well, it's a combination of things. We have to get back in the business of home ownership. I am blown away, when I was a child, that mom was able to purchase a home in Queens. We live in a 4-story rat-infested tenement, and she was able to purchase that home by cleaning the homes of others.
Yeah.
That dream is snatched away when you look at this city, the cost of purchasing a home. So we've put around $9 million into assisting in down payments. In fiscal year 2022, $53 million and expanding, home ownership. So the goal is to really do a combination, allow people the opportunity, the pathway of home ownership, and being creative in doing so, finding those different opportunities. My first ownership was a co-op. I was able to have a co-op, a low-income co-op. Was able to move I went from renting to a co-op to purchasing my 3-family home. And mind you, my 3-family home, I have tenants in there for the last almost 15 years. When they signed their lease, I signed into the lease. I can never raise your rent as long as you are in my building. We have to stop talking about it and being about it.
And actually do it. Is
Yes.
everything? So, we have here a question from one of the folks in our audience, Judith from the West Village. And she wants to know, how do you envision the conversion of commercial buildings to residential to include very affordable housing?
Well, it's a combination. If we do the right changes in Albany, then we could have a conversation and move away from the market rate that we saw downtown. And I believe in this concept, something I saw in other countries called, instead of we work, we live. My son lived differently. He has a stove in his apartment. I don't think he knows how to turn it on. He eats out. Yeah. He loves this shared living. So why can't we do a real examination of the rules that state every bedroom must have a window? You don't need no window when you're sleeping. It should be dark, And instead of doing that, have studio apartments, then share living and working spaces. My son enjoyed that whole dormitory sort of setting. I think we have to reinvent our conversation, a modern day almost SRO concept. There's some great models I've saw across the globe. It's affordable. We could tie in real affordable prices to it, and then we do allow the cross-pollination of ideas and people living together.
Gotcha. So I want to shift gears a little bit to talk about homelessness. I mean, in the last few years alone, we've seen a rising number of homeless people. And part of that is due to the fact that we have this influx of asylum seekers who've been coming into this country over the last year. So I know you've asked for federal assistance, but absent that, what can the city do to bring down the number of people who are living without shelter?
Great question. And, I think that, I'm a big upstream thinker. And when you look at our policies, you'll see we're rooted in upstream. Archbishop Desmond Tutu said, spend a lifetime pulling people out of the river instead of going upstream and preventing them from falling in the first place. So we have to think differently. That's why we are investing in foster care and also investing in those other issues that are upstream thinking. A young child growing up in a homeless shelter is 3 times less likely to graduate from high school. If you don't educate, you will incarcerate. And that's why we see 80% of our inmates at Rikers Island don't have a high school diploma or equivalency diploma. We're feeding the criminal justice and the homeless crisis. And so when we took office, I spent January and February in the streets. People criticize our plan, but I went to the streets January and February at night by myself, visited people in encampments and in tents and in boxes. What did I see inside? Drug paraphernalia, human waste, schizophrenic, bipolar, stale food, unkept. It was unacceptable. And so our mission in the subway system, when I wrote the subway system, we had a woman that was sleeping under the stairs in the subway system, and we normalized that. We normalized people on the trains living in unkept condition. That was just unacceptable for me. 4,000 people, we were able to get off the subway system. Over 1,000, roughly 1,200 are still in wraparound services. One of the most touching stories that I know of was a woman that lived on the street for almost 25 years. I'm hoping to go see her in the next day or so. We now have a wraparound service. She's off the street. She's been there for a while, stabilizing her. Dr. Fasan, who is a master at this whole concept, rolled out the second phase of our homeless issue. Many of our homeless individuals are dealing with severe mental health issues. And we have to give them the services they deserve. Because you know what happens? Close to 48% of the people on Rikers Island have mental health issues, and 18% have severe mental health issues. We wait until they commit a crime, and then we give them the support. So the audacity of Eric of saying, no, I'm going to help you before you commit a crime. I'm going to help you before you go to the emergency room. I'm going to help you before you harm yourself. We have to be proactive and not reactive, and that is why we're focusing on the homelessness that we're seeing in the city.
And is there a point where we can claim, or the city can claim, like, yes, this is a success? I mean, having wraparound services and following someone through treatment, that takes a long time, right? Like that takes
Yes, it does.
a considerable amount of money. So at what point can we claim, okay, we've gotten this under control? Is there a point?
Listen, I'm hoping we can. This is a 40-year problem. Then to add on the 40-year problem, think about what happened January 1st, 2022. When I became mayor, we had about 35,000 people in our homeless systems scattered out. In 1 year, we're now having 51,000 people on top of that. 51,000 that came in a little over a year. Not only did we give them food, shelter, clothing, education, health care, we treated them with dignity that they deserve. And every one of them that I visited, you know what they said? We don't want free food. We don't want free health care. We want to work.
Right.
And when you add that on, nowhere else in the country is doing what the people of New York City is doing. Nowhere else. I visited El Paso. I visited Los Angeles. I visited other cities. We're the only place in the country that are treating people who are fleeing persecution to come here with the dignity they deserve.
So what happens next to all these folks? I mean, it seems that Congress has been deadlocked on immigration reform for as long as I've been alive, basically. So is there anything that the city can be doing to make sure that they're now finding work or integrating them into this neighborhood or into their neighborhoods?
Well, they want to. And we rolled out today with Governor Hochul, Kathy Wilder, the partnership, We Love New York. And it's really calling us all to play our part. To go tutor a young person in a homeless shelter. Go speak with an asylum seeker and, help them understand English. If we just volunteer, 8.5 million people, if we just volunteer 1 hour a week, every Wednesday night at 9 p.m., I'm on 34th Street between 7th and 8th Avenue handing out food to people who are down on their luck, going through a difficult time. And you know what it means for them to walk and get a plate of food from the mayor of the city of New York, knowing he's there, and then we go over to the side and I speak with them about what are their issues, engaging with them one-on-one. We all can do that.
Right.
Everyone can just donate just 1 hour a week. Everyone's talking about Rikers Island. I don't see them on Rikers. I've been on Rikers Island more than any mayor in the history of New York City. Thanksgiving Day, I spent Thanksgiving Day with a woman who just gave birth on Rikers Island. We need to all volunteer. We need to all say, here's where I am in my life. I'm a believer. You deposit into the social bank of life, you could draw on the equity when you need it. And while government does its job, there's a responsibility for citizens to do their job. And we need to step up, and we're not stepping up. And we have to be honest about, are we stepping up? This is a Michael Jackson moment. Got to look at the man and the woman in the mirror and see what you're doing.
Yeah, I mean, we only have you for a couple more minutes. So I want to ask you, I mean, you're a native New Yorker. You've born here, grew up here. You've inherited the city in the middle of a crisis, and you're seeing it evolve in front of our eyes. How do you make sure that the New York that's coming in the next few years is equitable? And is there anything stopping that?
Well, listen, I think that, Tracy, my other half, says all the time, you could never complain. You're the mayor of New York. And this is a great moment for us. We've taken a broken child, dyslexic, bullied, arrested, denied, watching mommy raise those 6 children. The city betrayed mommy. I was lucky. You should not have to be lucky in this city. So you have someone that has traveled through what people are going through. And I'm the mayor. And if you do a deep analysis of my policies and programs, there's never been a mayor that's doing what we're doing. Our team is focused. Each one of them come with a personal story of their betrayal. This is the right time for me to be the mayor of this city. And right now, you're going to see the results of a compassionate, caring, understanding mayor. It's a challenging time. It's hard for us. But we're going to get through it, just as we got through the Depression, just as we got through 9/11, just as we got through COVID. We're going to get through it.
And Mayor, just one last question for you. I know we have a limited amount of time. Do you think that New York City is your forever home? Do you see yourself living here for the rest of your life?
It's only 2 types of people on this planet, those who live in New York and those who wish they could. I'm going nowhere.
Great. Well, thank you very much for all of your time. We really appreciate you coming out here. And thank you all. Please give us a round of applause for the mayor. Thank you so much. So we're going to hear from a panel of people who are experts in housing from all corners of the city. And in the meantime, they're going to try to set up behind me. So if you bear with me, it's some little audience participation questions. So by a raise of hands, how many of you live in the 5 boroughs right now? All right, that's pretty much more than half of the room. And for those who have their hands raised, how many of you see yourself living here in 10 years? What about 15 years? 20? All right, I have a feeling some of us are fibbing ourselves. But so one of the biggest issues that we've seen coming up over the last few months has really been affordability and can I continue to live in this city in the future? Can I raise a family here? Can I have kids here? And what is the cost of that? Or is it, moving out into the suburbs? So we want to really talk about how we view the city in the future. At the start of this event, you should have gotten some cards. And if you haven't, raise your hands and we'll get some of those to you. But we want to ask you, the audience, to ask us questions. We're going to have a panel coming in very shortly with some top housing experts, and that way we can ask them what's important to you. So in the meantime, if you've already filled out your questionnaire, do you mind passing it to the end of the row that you're sitting in, and someone will come by and collect them. So anyone else need a card? We got some folks in the front, some folks over there in the back. Great. All right, and someone over here, over onto my left. All right, well, thank you all very much. I think we're almost through over here. We want to make sure that all of your questions that you have are answered. We have a bunch of different topics to get onto, including, you know, office conversions, what happens in the next 10 years, how do we build housing, which I think is the biggest one, and how do we create affordable housing. So if you just bear with us for a couple more seconds as they're getting those around. Great. All right. I think we're almost set. We need one more back there for folks. We have limited time. We only have about half an hour left of our program and maybe 40 minutes, so we try to get to as many questions as possible through this. Great. All right, so I want to introduce you folks to our ACE panelists here. We've got Comptroller Brad Lander, the city's Chief Housing Officer Jessica Katz, City Planning Commissioner and Managing Attorney for Housing and Policy at Mobilization for Justice, Leah Goodridge, and Vishaan Chakrabarty, the Founder and Creative Director for Practice for Architecture and Urbanism. Thank you all so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. Welcome to the stage. So we just heard the mayor talk about his plan to create more housing and how he plans to make that happen. So Comptroller, I want to start with you. Just last month you said that the city's in a severe housing crisis. Does the mayor's plan have enough in it for affordable housing and spurring affordable housing?
So I think the work to create new housing is critical that the governor and mayor are working on. I can still show you the scars from the Gowanus rezoning, where we permitted 8,000 new units, 3,000 genuinely affordable in our neighborhood, and got the community actually to support it. But new supply on its own, while critical, will not be enough. It takes a while for those units to filter down. Mm-hmm. So you also have to protect tenants from being evicted at the same time. That's why strengthening eviction protections like good cause eviction in Albany is critical. The 7 top neighborhoods for eviction and 8 of the top 10 in New York City are in the Bronx, because it's not only about the neighborhoods where gentrification is taking place and new supply might be possible, it's also about protecting low-income tenants from housing precarity. So more supply, yes. Stronger tenant protections, yes. More deeply affordable and social housing to make sure we're genuinely creating affordable units while we're also creating new market rate ones.
Gotcha. And Jessica, just to follow up on something that the comptroller said, how do you what are the biggest barriers to building affordable housing or the creation of affordable housing right now?
Sure. So, we lost a lot of the tools that we once had to create new housing. We lost 2 critical tax programs, J51 and 421A. What we do have, which is unusual in my career, in the span of my career, I spent a lot of my energy fighting for more rental assistance programs, because there's an extent to which the most deeply affordable housing, you can't afford to keep the lights on at the rents that those tenants can afford to pay. So affordable for whom is a really salient question, as we've talked about many times. And there's the lowest income tiers, you can't develop your way into those. So now we have, kind of as victims of our own success, we've created a lot of rental subsidy programs, which didn't exist previously. It's one of the only cities that has our own homegrown taxpayer-funded rental subsidy program. And now I've got 20,000 people walking around New York City with a voucher, and there's no place to build it. So finally, for the first time, that question, affordable for whom, is kind of turned on its head, where now I have people with vouchers, that golden ticket that lets you afford a unit regardless of how low income you are. And now we're really hitting up against a significant supply problem. So I think that tone has really changed a lot, even in the year and change since this administration has been in there. And I think the housing crisis has gotten so bad that the supply question there's been a lot of change in tone on that. So that's been really nice to see. And I think we have some momentum to try to turn that around so that those tens of thousands of New Yorkers who have vouchers will finally have a place to use them.
Gotcha. And Vishaan and Leah, a question for you is there anything that we can do or the city can do that's maybe something on the small scale that can spur housing or affordable housing creative accessibility, or just having more affordable housing available? Is there something that's a short-term solution to making sure that people who need affordable housing can actually get it or stay in it? Leah, let's start with you.
My take on this is that I do think that the city can fund more affordable housing. I think that, of course, we can have more vouchers, but in addition to being on the City Planning Commission, I'm also a tenants' rights attorney, and one of the big issues that we see is a lot of landlords don't take vouchers, even if there are laws against it. And so I don't feel like that's the actual solution. I think that we really do need to look at the housing crisis and frame it in a way that the conversation around defund the police framed, where we looked at the funding, because that movement forced us to look at what we fund, how much money we're putting into the solution, a situation, and if we're attacking the root as opposed to just Band-Aids. And so I think that we can fund more affordable units, and I do think that pushing as a resolution to the housing crisis in the hands of private developers, where you have these programs, from my perspective, I think it leads to a lot of fights. And I'll also just quickly say that a lot of the fights that we've had in terms of building in my backyard, I think are being inaccurately framed. It's not about people are saying no to housing. Sure, there's some people who are saying that, but a lot of people are saying no to luxury housing that costs $5,000 for a studio. And what they're saying is, right? And so what they're saying is, I want more affordable housing. I've been living in New York City for 20, 30 years. I've been working, sometimes people work for the city and can't afford to rent these apartments. And so this isn't really about, I don't want housing in my backyard. This is about, I've been living here all of my life. I can't afford to buy a home. I can barely now afford to rent. You need to put more affordable housing units in there.
And one of the things that the mayor's office has announced is this plan to try and convert some of those offices in Midtown into apartments. But it sounds simple enough in theory. I'm sure it's not just a matter of throwing up some sheetrock and calling it a day. So Vishaan, I want to hear from you. How does the city do this? Can you walk us through how conversion works?
Well, the mayor mentioned what happened in Lower Manhattan after 9/11. I was Manhattan planning director right after 9/11, and we did do a lot of those conversions. The lower Midtown, Manhattan office stock is different than Midtown. They're smaller buildings or older buildings. They have operable windows. Emily Badger wrote a great article in the New York Times that goes through the graphics and the kind of physics of what this will take. I mean, I'm a believer in office to residential conversion. I'm also a believer that some of these buildings that are difficult to convert will turn into cheaper office space, which also is a form of infrastructure for the city and is a good thing overall. It means that companies that have sort of less means can afford to have their businesses here, which is also an important thing. I worry about the level of subsidy it's going to take to subsidize the conversion of the buildings, in addition to then saying, well, we want it to be affordable, and then we want it to be green, and then it's going to be more and more public money, and is that the best place to be spending our public housing dollars? I think that's a question. I want to go back to your other question, though, because, I think we got a lot of really interesting conversation on the tenant side. On the new construction side, maybe what I can help add to the conversation. So we're the architects for this project in East New York. It's 100% affordable. It's for Reverend A.R. Bernard. It's 2,200 units of affordable housing. The affordability is pegged to the local neighborhood. It's about 60 to 80% AMI. There's a performing arts center. There's all sorts of social infrastructure, vocational training, 24/7 daycare. It's like motherhood and apple pie. There's even a home ownership component. Had a huge amount of community support. So what's wrong? It took over 5 years to get approved. From the first time I put pencil to paper to the time we actually got through approvals, even though it had a lot of community support. There's also issues of how much, state bond cap there is and city bond money there is for that kind of affordable housing, which I'm not the expert on, the person to my left is. But, that's a problem, I would argue. Because if I take at her word that people want affordable housing in their neighborhood, and I do, sometimes, then why is it taking so long? Because we need to be, my family and I spent some time in San Francisco during the pandemic. San Francisco is a cautionary tale for all of us.
How so?
In terms of how expensive it's become, in terms of the fact that there's 70% office vacancy rates now. Right? You're looking at a problem with people, the unhoused, that is astronomical compared to New York City. And there's a lot of problems both on the right and the left side of the political spectrum that's created the situation in San Francisco. And we should be very, very careful to not become that. And when I look at the case studies that we talk about building new construction, I worry about how much time it takes. And how much, last thing, is just how much it costs.
Right.
Because we layer more and more social goods into these projects to the point where they cannot get off the ground, even if there's a regulatory structure to approve them.
Comptroller, I saw you trying to chime in.
Sorry.
Actually, I was going to ask Vishaan a question because
Yeah,
with
please.
some of these Class B and C office buildings, I love an adaptive reuse or a conversion where you can make it work, but I'm pretty skeptical, even with the changes that we're making, that we're going to get a lot of them. I wonder if some of them we ought to authorize for them to be torn down, let a residential building get built that's 25 or 30% bigger. We're talking about Midtown, a good place for density. Why don't we look at that as a way of creating a significant chunk of new units?
Sure, although, I hate tearing stuff down when you don't have to. There's a lot of embodied energy in our building stock that, but yeah, if you can get a lot more density, sure.
I just wonder whether we can get affordability in Midtown office conversions without it.
Yeah. I think it's going to be a case-by-case basis, honestly.
And Jessica, thoughts on that?
I think Vishaan is underselling all the important work that he did after 9/11, and I think we saw that really come to fruition 20 years later. So, a couple of crises later in New York City, you saw, even in the pit of the quarantine of the pandemic, you saw people walking their dog in Lower Manhattan.
Yeah.
And that's because 20 years earlier, we made some regulatory reforms that take a while to roll out into the market and into the neighborhoods and onto the street. We made some changes that made Lower Manhattan a 24/7 neighborhood where people live. That
But
diversity
almost
in that
none
mix.
of it affordable. Almost none of it affordable.
So that mix, though, was a huge boost to the neighborhood. And then in the next crisis, which we never could have anticipated, none of us did, we had a neighborhood that was more resilient and that bounced back significantly faster than what you see in Midtown now. So I think bearing that in mind, that we don't know what the next time, we don't know what New York City's next punch is, how it's going to come and what it's going to look like. So to create as much flexibility for ourselves that we can adapt more quickly, I think that's what the goal of the office conversions strategy is that we don't know, if any of us could predict what the future of work is, then we would, not be sitting on this panel. But we know it's going to be different than it is today, and certainly than it was 5 years ago, and we need to build in that flexibility for those buildings to be able to earn their use in a new moment, regardless of what changes come to pass.
So Leah, your organization is on the front lines of helping people who can't afford an attorney. The last 3 years have been undeniably difficult for everyone. What are you hearing from tenants and homeowners and about how their needs have changed when it comes to housing?
Well, the first thing I'll say is, I joined the City Planning Commission. I was appointed by Public Advocate Jamani Williams, and I joined about a year ago. And before that, I was on the New York City Rent Guidelines Board, and then, I've been practicing as a tenants' rights attorney for the last 10 years. And I have to say, one thing that's extremely jarring to me is being at the table. The conversation is so drastically different from what I'm hearing like everyday New Yorkers say. So, for example, when we talk about affordable housing, none of my clients, most of them cannot afford the actual affordable housing sometimes being built, right? And so, and I don't have a problem with moderate income being included in affordable housing, but the problem is we're talking about 30%, most of the time these affordable, we're talking about 25%, 30% of like 1,000 units, right? And so if we have only of that small portion, a bunch of those incomes, some of the incomes start at $80,000, I don't think that that's really affordable housing. And so a lot of my clients, that's the first thing they say. The second thing they say is that, obviously, what I've noticed is that their voices aren't, it's almost like people are in a bubble. And that's, I have to be honest and say, when I sort of thought that this job was kind of going to be, I was just going to be in the background like a policy wonk, and what ended up happening is I just, things got very loud because I'm like, actually, the conversations are drastically different. The affordable housing part is different. Another aspect that I'm seeing on the ground just very quickly is, it just seems like tenants' rights are under, we can talk about home ownership, that's another thing, but tenants' rights are under attack. The rent stabilization is being attacked in litigation. It may even go to the Supreme Court, and that would be drastic for New York City to lose rent stabilization. Funding for even legal services attorneys, there's not enough funding for that. My colleagues are at capacity, and we constantly have to reject cases. So a lot of people that come to us, they're upset, but the background is, we don't have enough, we're not being funded enough, and so we can't take on all of these cases. So it's a huge, it's almost from every different angle, tenants' rights are being attacked. And when we have the conversation at the table, it's not matching what everyday New Yorkers are experiencing.
Richard, do you want to chime in on that?
I hear all of that. I think it's all so true. I think we have to ask ourselves what's creating that level of pressure. And to me, it's a fairly straightforward thing. We create about 3.5 times more jobs than housing. And I'm not saying new construction is the solution to everything. I'm really not. But when you have that kind of multiple going on, and that kind of multiple going on even post-pandemic, you're going to end up with those kinds of pressures. And then you have to ask yourself why I can take the subway and get 1 or 2 stops out of Manhattan in a lot of different directions and find 1- and 2-story housing, right? Because we are going to keep having that situation if that's the case.
Comptroller, I see you.
It just has to be both. And the reason that those tenants facing eviction in the Bronx can't get the lawyers that they were promised by our right to counsel legislation is not because we didn't build enough housing post-pandemic. It's because we haven't made good on providing a commitment that we made. So I totally agree with you that we need more housing supply, but this can't be like a tennis ball where like one side says we need more housing supply,
I totally agree.
the other side we need more tenant protections, until we've got to provide every one of those tenants the rights they have under right to counsel, because it's long-term work, and that's why we've got to build a set of systems that are going to produce units as incomes people can genuinely afford. And I'll just give one more example here. The 421A program has been mentioned a couple of times. I did support that sunsetting last year because the main thing it had become was an outer borough program that was 70% market rate, and the 30% so-called affordable was mostly at 130% of the area median income. Yes. So that's for a family of 4, $175,000. That is not affordable to the vast majority, 75 or 80% of New Yorkers. So let's say, yes, in the outer boroughs, we want development. We want development in East New York. We want development in a lot of places. But let's make it like a new Mitchell-Lama style. You get a tax break. You get a density bonus. You get some capital subsidy. But what it's got to be is multifamily affordable cooperatives for families at $60,000, $80,000 a year, as well as some of the genuinely and deeply affordable. That, I think, gives people a lot more reason to be part of pro-growth city.
Jessica, your thoughts?
And I think that's happening, right? I think we're here sort of demonstrating and acting out the kind of age-old back and forth housing policy debates. At the same time, what I'm hearing when I go to Albany consistently is a real sea change, and we saw that at the city council also. So several years ago, we were kind of at this apex of this pitched battle between, are we doing supply or are we doing tenant rights? Are we doing development? Are we going to help these guys or are we going to help these guys? Now I think that that debate has really changed significantly, both on the ground and in Albany, and certainly at the city council. Where I
Hopefully
think
in Albany.
because-
We'll see.
hopefully
They
in
got a few
Albany,
weeks to show
but
it,
the,
don't
but the
they?
tone has changed, right?
Yes.
Like I was laughed out of people's offices last year when I tried to have a conversation about housing supply, and I think this year people realize that it is at it's such a level of need that we're really having a conversation about how it's not one or the other, and I think that's become apparent to a much wider range of people. We had a new class of city council members come in. I think there was some real concern that new people who are term limited, who are looking at a 2-year term, a 1-year term, are not going to be looking at the long term, 10 years down the road, who are my constituents going to be in this district and who's going to need housing then. And in fact, we saw the opposite. We saw council member after council member sit down and say, well, this project isn't perfect, but I think it's better than we had. Let me fight to get better than we had and like find a way to compromise. And that just wasn't the rhetoric pre-pandemic, and it certainly wasn't the rhetoric for most of my time in the housing business. So I do think that the tide is turning in a way that makes everybody across the spectrum realize that you really do have to do both of these things at the same time, and you can't do one without the other.
And I bet one
Can
thing
I-
we
can I
all
just say
agree on
something
is that's
quickly?
got to
Sorry,
be in the
let me-
suburbs as well.
Let
Leah.
me just quickly say, I think, and this is one thing I want to make clear that often gets muddied in the housing debate, and I think it was just a, tenant side versus supply side. This is what I'm saying. There is no two sides. People in the tenant movement want affordable housing. And so there's sort of this sort of like narrative of that, like, and let's just be real, it is mostly funded and bred by developers of like, this is like, we need more supply and we need to like knock out, people who are against us, and it's mostly tenants, and people want, once again, a lot of these fights aren't about that people don't want housing in their backyard. It is that the housing that's being built is not affordable enough. And I just want to end by saying that sometimes the solution that I've heard being pitched is that, well, you know what? In order to address this, we'll just increase people's incomes. Great, we should all get higher salaries. But let's just address the fact that some of these apartments are woefully too high. The rent is too high. I have, people calling that are not income eligible, $5,000, because we have a hotline, we get a lot of people calling, $5,000 for a 1-bedroom, they still have rats, and so, but some of them are just ridiculous. Like, you hear the amount, they're not, I don't know where they're getting the rent prices from. And so I do think that we need to really look at regulation of the rent. They should not reach a point where it's $7,000 for a studio in Brooklyn, which is what's happening,
Right.
So,
It actually segues into a question that we have from the audience. It doesn't have a name or a speaker here, but they are asking, how do we make office to apartment conversions economically sensible for developers?
So
Jessica, do you wanna start?
so the program that we have been working with our partners in Albany on is twofold. One are some of these regulatory reforms that we've talked about that would just make it fundamentally easier to do physically to convert the buildings, because we have a ton of different regulations at both the city and state level that currently make it impossible. So really brushing that patchwork away and creating a more rational system of rules that would make it take less time and create less approvals, and just to make that a clean pathway in the regulations. And then the second piece is the tax incentive that would add on that layer of affordability as well, because we really do want to incentivize that as much as possible.
Visha, any thoughts on that?
I mean, that all sounds wonderful. I just, I think that we have something like 400 million square feet of office space in Manhattan. If we convert a few percentage points of those. Like this is an important issue, and it's a good issue for policymakers. This is not the silver bullet to our housing crisis by any stretch of the imagination, and we shouldn't frame it as that. I think it's good for Midtown to get more housing for a bunch of different reasons, for everything from public space to safety to retail. But like, this is not going to solve the affordable housing crisis in New York City.
Is there a silver bullet then? I'll take that as a no. Comptroller, it seems like you wanted to chime in.
I grew up in a Mitchellama. I think that's funny. In Brownsville.
We got to do a lot of things. We have to do a lot of things. We have a set of work to do to protect tenants from being evicted today. We got a lot of work to do to make sure housing can get built more quickly and efficiently. We need to expand the supply of what people sometimes call social housing, housing that's removed outside the speculative marketplace, things exactly like Mitchellama co-ops and supportive and affordable housing owned by land trusts and nonprofits. That's about 10% of the market today. Could be 20% of the market. So that's a lot of things we have to do, and we got to get busy with them.
I mean, I think it's important to understand that we passed a series of laws in this country through the 80s and 90s that basically made it illegal for the federal government to build housing. The developer system we have today, right, didn't just come out of nowhere, right? I mean, Reagan won every state in this country except for one in 1984. A bunch of people on the left voted for this guy. And in 1986, tax reform completely changed the way we build housing in this country. And so when people talk about developers, you have to remember that, like, we created this system. We can create a different system if you want, right? But, like, there's a whole set of reasons that we live with the system that we have today. There aren't enough players in the housing market, and there aren't enough people. We have to figure out how to bring down the cost of building housing in this city, right? It's astronomically high, and it's always going to push up. You know, there's just so much regulation can do about that. And sometimes regulation is part of the problem.
Right. And Jessica, you sort of mentioned that there are some regulations and rules on board that have been here for decades, if not even longer, that are really stymieing the production. So what are some of those? I mean, is there anything that you can talk to about, how do we get rid of some of these regulatory sort of tape?
Sure. We have rules that make it possible to convert an office building from 1978, but if it's from 1982, then you can. If it's in this neighborhood, you can't. Like, you have to hire a $1,000 an hour lawyer just to know who you are in that landscape. We have regulations that make it impossible to make basements safer. We have regulations where the state governs whether or not you could build a 30-story office tower, but only a 15-story residential building. That's a state law that governs our local zoning in a way that doesn't exist in any other parts of our local zoning code or any other parts of the state. So there's kind of from the one family home in East New York to a office tower in Midtown Manhattan, we have like a set of red tape that we need to resolve and a set of processes that take an extremely, extremely long time.
And basements are a great example for this year, where we really need Albany to step up because we don't have the power in New York City to make it safer and legal for folks who are already living in basements. As you know, we saw some folks die during Hurricane Ida, but we probably have 100,000 families living in basements, and we don't have the power to set a safe regulatory structure in place. That's one thing Albany hopefully will do for us this legislative session, is let New York City take a real step forward on that process.
And Josefa, we talked to, all of us are kind of go quiet suddenly when you ask about a silver bullet for housing. There's no silver bullet for housing. There's going to have to be 100 silver bullets. But I'll tell you what is sort of I don't know what the opposite, a lead bullet, is. If we don't preserve NYCHA, then none of the rest of this is going to matter. Because we have 600,000 people living in NYCHA, and there's nothing else we can do to nibble around the edges if we don't take that head on.
Right. And I mean, the mayor mentioned this proposal that's gaining steam out in Chelsea, where you are essentially tearing down a NYCHA facility and building one next to it, moving folks into that place. That is almost an unfathomable thing to happen in New York, to tear down a building and place folks in public housing into this new building. How can that work on a broader scale? I mean, is there a way to move all these 6,000 people into a new place while we fix NYCHA, which is falling apart at this point?
So we have a couple, there's not going to be one strategy for NYCHA, but we did have significant success over the past several years as we are building trust in our RAD PACT program. So last year we did 6,000 units of conversions under that program, which converts from a Section 9 subsidy to a Section 8 subsidy, which is a much more robust income stream. So we've had success in that, and when a development completes a RAD program, almost inevitably, we see the TA president across the street give us a call and say, hey, what did they get over there? But that's not for everybody, right? And giving someone one single option kind of backs people into a corner where that doesn't feel like a set of options that NYCHA residents were comfortable with. So we went to Albany and we created the Public Housing Preservation Trust as an alternative to the PACT program. Now, every single NYCHA resident is going to get to vote on whether or not they choose which track they want to go down.
So I see the gears turning
Well,
behind your eyes.
I have some involvement with this that I can just speak so much about, but this has to be tenant driven at NYCHA. I think we would all agree to that. But I think people need to understand when you say, well, it's almost unfathomable. These buildings do not meet any modern code standard you can imagine, right? So the most basic things of getting an ambulance gurney into an elevator, right? You saw what happened during Sandy, right? Like these buildings are at the end of their physical life. And we have to confront this as a city, work with residents to figure out how to get them into dignity, right? And I think residents are really starting to feel that this is their imperative as well. But like, we have to rethink this. What is, I think, going to be the challenge isn't going to be with the residents. It's going to be with the surrounding neighborhoods that are going to have to realize that the density in those blocks is going to have to increase to make all of this work. NYCHA housing is, for the most part, extraordinarily low density. Meaning that, like, I know you don't want to get into like zoning speak, the wonky stuff, but like it's almost half the density of most of its surrounding neighborhoods, even though they're tall towers, because there's so much weird open space around them. And so that, I think, is going to end up being a big part of the charged political debate around this. But it's going to be a transformation, and it has to happen.
Lee, I see you also nodding.
I don't know about nodding, but I forgot to give a disclaimer. I'm speaking in my own capacity as opposed to like representing the City Planning Commission. I forgot to say that. I think you all probably might have guessed it anyway. So as soon as I started,
So far, I think Jumani probably agrees with the things you've said, so,
yeah. We cut off all, yeah. So, I was probably shaking my head because I started my career representing NYCHA residents in a lot of repair cases. So, I mean, I think that we all can agree that there are a lot of issues with the buildings, mainly because, honestly, quite frankly, the city allowed it to happen, and still happens. People have all kind, no heat, no hot water. I used to have something I call with my clients Batman, where, that you call the 707 number and you say, I have a ticket, and you're supposed to come, and then, then they say, I came, and they left, and my client was there all day, and so they're like, oh, Batman, you came. But anyway.
We're starting an audit of that, so we're going to call it the Batman audit.
Good,
now.
yeah.
Right.
Let us know when that comes through.
But I think the main contention here isn't necessarily about fixing up the NYCHA buildings. I think the main contention is privatizing it. And what's going to happen with that regard. So there have been a lot of tenants pushing back about that. And I just want to quickly add that it's been a lot of this particular issue, NYCHA was constantly brought up, dog whistle politics at the Rent Guidelines Board. People would constantly, so I was on the Rent Guidelines Board as a tenant rep, and the landlord side, not necessarily the reps, people who would come and testify would constantly bring it up and say, well, we can't have rent control and rent stabilization because do you want to be like NYCHA? And I always, questioned and challenged it as dog whistle politics because it's always, people often, how we were talking about what does woke mean? It really means black. Well, I constantly say and ask, do you just mean that we're talking about housing where you foresee that a lot of black people live there, and so now you're going to make it like you don't want this to be NYCHA, do you? And so I'll just quickly say we've been talking a lot about housing, but my particular point that I've been making specifically at the City Planning Commission as a tenants' rights attorney is the housing crisis does not apply equally to all. It is specifically racialized displacement. A lot of black people are being pushed out. If you live in a majority black zip code, you're 3 times more likely to be evicted. I mean, there was a lot of data about this. But back to NYCHA specifically, the issue isn't necessarily about whether we want better buildings. We do. The issue is, will it be privatized or not? Will people be pushed out? And when I hear that residents are going to be transferred to another, I mean, look, people, look, yeah. I mean, I'll just say, something as simple as like submitting your recertification and it getting lost and stuff. Like, I can't even imagine, what happens when a whole group of residents are moved from one building. They have to move back. I foresee that there are probably going to be a lot of complications with that. But if the end result is to have not to have dilapidated buildings and to have a better building structure, and it not be privatized and people can still live there, great. But if it's not, then obviously we're going to have questions. We, being the tenant movement, are going to have questions about that.
Jessica, any thoughts on that? How do we create a system where people aren't going to fall through the cracks if they are doing this, demolition, moving, and getting put back into these apartments?
I think the key ingredient that we found at Fulton and Chelsea was that the tenants were in the decision-making seat. So we're really moving at the speed of trust with the tenants. They had a couple different options in front of them, and they picked the one that was best for them. And I think what they said to us loud and clear after negotiating for quite some time about any number of different scenarios of rehabbing the existing buildings was, I don't want $1 billion worth of duct tape. You got to give me something better. And so the tenants actually demanded that of us. That's not going to be the case in every development. There's a huge diversity of the culture and of the leadership across the tenants in NYCHA. But in Fulton and Chelsea, they watch, to them, it was almost like gentrification wasn't a dirty word. They saw gentrification happening all over, and they said, can you give me a little bit of that? Can I benefit from some of that? And they asked us for new buildings. So we're still working through the details of that, but really making sure that the tenant leaders were given the decision-making authority to do what was best for their tenants was really the secret sauce in that process. And it's ongoing, and it's going to have its, it's going to have its good days and bad days, honestly. That's the nature of the game. But I think we're putting the tenants in the driver's seat was a bit of a scary thing to do for government. That's not what we're used to, is giving somebody else, decision-making authority. And it really has been successful so far, and we've been trying to do that at some of these conversions across the city.
Gotcha. We are almost running out of time, and I want to make sure to ask this question before letting you all go. So I'd like to go down the line and ask you if there's anything the city or the state, maybe even the federal government, can do in the next year that'll help New Yorkers either stay in this city or find an affordable apartment within their price range in this city that will reap benefits 10 years down the line, 20 years down the line. So, Comptroller, we'll start with you and work our way this way.
Well, if I had to pick one thing, it would be that 21st Century Mitchell Lama program that could make a new generation of working class homeowners, those black families who are leaving the city who don't see their future here. We did that at Amalgamated Houses in Co-op City and Penn South. We can do it again.
Great, thank you. Leah?
I was going to say home ownership as well. Also, just apart from that, I do think it would be helpful to have town hall specifically about the housing crisis, because as I mentioned before, I just think the conversation on the ground is a little bit different sometimes than what's being had at the table. So I think that would be helpful as well to give a tenant voice. But more homeownership programs, funding for eviction prevention, but that's at the last stage, right? So we need protection for rent stabilized apartments. We need funding for more affordable units and more than 30%, because I don't think that that's enough. And also, when we do have the affordable units, for it to be deep affordability, meaning that they don't start at $50,000 for you to be eligible.
Great, thank you. Vishon?
I think we have to remember that New York City is extraordinarily lucky coming out of the pandemic, in the sense that I work in cities all across the country, and most cities do not have the residential backbone that we have. And so they're empty at 6 o'clock, and it's scary. And I don't mean scary from a crime perspective. I mean scary from a, what's this place going to become perspective. And so we need to keep going the love of New York City that keeps people living here, which of course includes making it affordable for everyone. I think the other piece I would just add to that, though, is we've designed an entire city around the idea that Don Draper's coming in and out of Midtown Manhattan every day at 9 o'clock. It's crazy, right? And we need to, those things that we call streets out there, why we let these 3,000-pound tanks occupy our city with as private SUVs when if we had a true express bus system, past congestion pricing, housing costs would shift around our transportation patterns, because historically housing's been expensive when it's close to where your job is, right? But if that changes, what housing costs can change across the geography of the city. So I think we really need to think holistically about how do we make sure that this city is a great residential city for the people who live here, but also for the people who want to live here, who have no political voice whatsoever.
Right. Great, thank you. And Jessica?
So I think at the federal government, the mayor is right that we don't expect a massive influx of capital towards NYCHA or anything else towards housing, but there are significant, the low-income housing tax credit program, there's significant resources that do come that have bipartisan support that we're hoping we see a great expansion of so that we can do more subsidized housing, and then so we could do more subsidized housing that's funded by the federal government. At the state level, we need the budgets to include the rent arrears money for NYCHA, so that NYCHA tenants can have the same benefits that many other renters got in the pandemic from the ERAP program. And then we have a suite of other regulatory reforms and supply reforms that we need the state to pass. That we just need the city to get back the reins in terms of a variety of our programs. And at the city level, I think we need to continue to center the voices of NYCHA leadership and homeless and formerly homeless New Yorkers who are telling us and driving our policies in terms of what we need to do to change. And then in order to take really seriously combating source of income discrimination and to make some of our processes a little bit easier so that when you go get a voucher, we're not putting you through the ringer and making you prove over and over and over again how poor you are before we get in the moment that you need our help the most, for us to actually be helpful and be customer service oriented and not kind of put you through the ringer of paperwork.
So let me ask you a follow-up based on the source of income question. I mean, like the mayor said up top, you have people with vouchers, but landlords who don't want to take them. How do you bolster that, the enforcement to make sure that if you do have a voucher in hand, you're able to find a home?
So I think there's three pieces to that. One is just having the housing supply that's necessary. Part of that is the source of income discrimination is a piece of it, but also the sheer lack of housing supply. There is no place for people to go. The second is enforcing and educating people on source of income discrimination. And the third is removing some of the administrative burdens that when you do find an apartment, it takes too long for us to get you in there. So I think that's the three-pronged approach, and each of them is pretty important, and we're not going to solve it without all three.
Great, well, thank you all for being here. All right. Thank you all. That is all the time. Well, we really enjoy the fact that we've got such an engaged audience on this. Housing is obviously a very important topic to all of us. But if you just give me a second, we would just want to take this time out to thank all of you for joining us. Brad, Leah, Vishan, Jessica, thank you so much for coming. And thank you for this robust discussion. This is our first newsroom event in the Greene space, and this is obviously an issue that New Yorkers are very passionate about and one that we're passionate about covering. So make sure to go to Gothamist.com to see our continued work on this and listen to WNYC. Thank you all for being here.